When stars fell silent, the sky above Valara Prime cracked open like a broken promise. Commander Sarah Chen felt the first tremor through the soles of her boots before the alarm screamed their warning. She stood in the observation hall of the Grand Citadel, watching diplomatic delegates from 17 star systems mingle beneath crystalline chandeliers that had hung undisturbed for 3,000 years. In the space of a heartbeat, everything changed. The shields flickered first. Those beautiful domes of shimmering energy that cradled the capital city in safety went dark in sections, like lights dying across a vast grid. Then came the sound. Not an explosion, but something worse. A tearing. The fabric of protected space being ripped apart by weapons that shouldn't exist, wielded by an enemy that had sworn peace just 6 cycles ago. The Kresh had lied. Their fleet had been hiding in the shadow of Valara's outer moon, waiting for this moment when the system's greatest leaders gathered in one place. It was not a battle. It was an execution dressed as war. Sarah moved before her mind caught up to her training. Her hand went to her sidearm as the first delegates began screaming. Through the massive windows, she watched fire rain from the heavens. Not the clean fire of energy weapons, but something organic and hungry, spreading across the defensive platforms like a living disease. The Kresh specialized in biological warfare, turning shields and armor into breeding grounds for their weapons. All personnel to evacuation stations. A voice crackled through her comm unit, barely audible over the rising chaos. This is not a drill. Hostile forces have breached Sector 7. All personnel. The transmission died in a wash of static. Sarah grabbed the nearest delegate, a tall Muridan ambassador whose face had gone pale beneath his scaled skin. "Move toward the east wing," she shouted over the noise. "The emergency transports are underground." "Go now." She didn't wait to see if he obeyed. Her training took over, and training said to find the primary protectee. In this citadel on this day that meant one person above all others, Princess Liara. The young Valerian heir was somewhere in this massive structure with her guardian escorts. Sarah had seen her earlier that morning, a small figure with luminous silver skin and eyes like captured starlight, sitting quietly beside her mother during the opening ceremonies. 12 years old by human standards, though the Valerians measured age differently. Old enough to understand duty, too young to understand what was coming. Sarah sprinted through corridors that had begun to shudder and groan. The citadel's organic architecture was dying, its living walls responding to the contamination spreading through the shield network. Cracks appeared in the ceiling, leaking a pale blue fluid that hissed when it touched the floor. Emergency lights strobed in patterns that hurt to look at. She found the royal wing in chaos. Valerian guards in their ceremonial armor lay scattered like broken statues, their bodies twisted by weapons that killed from the inside out. Sarah forced herself not to look too closely. She had seen what Kresh bioweapons did to living tissue. The nightmares would come later if there was a later. "Princess Liara," she called out, knowing it was dangerous to make noise but having no choice. "Royal Guard, report." Silence answered her, broken only by the groan of dying architecture and the distant thunder of bombardment. Sarah moved deeper into the wing, checking rooms with the systematic precision of someone who had cleared hostile buildings on a dozen worlds. Each empty chamber increased the cold weight in her chest. The throne room doors hung open, massive panels of carved crystal that had been blown inward by some tremendous force. Sarah entered with her weapon raised, scanning corners and shadows. The queen's throne sat empty, its living vines already withering without the shield's protection. Scattered across the floor lay the remnants of a hurried evacuation. Dropped belongings, a child's learning tablet still displaying geometric patterns, one small shoe made of woven starlight. Sarah's comm unit crackled back to life. "All remaining forces, this is Commander Aldris. Primary evacuation is complete. Secondary transports are lifting off in 90 seconds. If you can hear this transmission, get to the launch platforms now. We cannot hold position any longer." She recognized that voice. Aldris was the Queen's personal military advisor, a gruff Valerian veteran who had fought in the last war. If he was ordering final evacuation, it meant the city was lost. It meant they were leaving. It meant Queen Thessura was already gone. Sarah stood in that dying throne room and made her choice. The smart decision was to run for the transports to save herself and let the odds claim whatever they would claim. She had done her duty. She had helped evacuate hundreds of delegates. No one would fault her for surviving, but she thought of that small shoe on the floor. She thought of a child's face, solemn and thoughtful during the morning ceremonies. She thought of a mother being forced onto an evacuation ship, searching the crowds for a daughter who wasn't there. "Chen to Aldris," she said into her comm. "I'm staying behind. There are still civilians unaccounted for." Static answered her for a moment. Then Aldris's voice came through, heavy with something that might have been respect or might have been grief. "Acknowledged, Commander. May the stars light your path." The connection died. Sarah was alone. She left the throne room and expanded her search, moving through sections of the citadel that were beginning to collapse. The Kresh bombardment had shifted to the northern districts, buying her minutes she shouldn't have had. She used them all. The royal gardens were located in the citadel's heart, a massive biodome that recreated Valara's ancient forests. Sarah found it by following a hunch and the faint sound of crying. The dome's ceiling had shattered, letting in smoke and ash from the burning city beyond. Ancient trees that had been transported across light years burned with flames that shifted through colors never seen in nature. There, beneath a fallen column wrapped in vines, she found her. Princess Liara huddled in a space barely large enough to shelter her small frame. Her silver skin was smudged with soot, her formal robes torn and dirty. She looked up as Sarah approached, and those starlight eyes went wide with fear before recognition settled in. "Commander Chen," the princess whispered. Her voice was steady despite everything, carrying the trained composure of someone raised for leadership. "My escorts fell. I tried to reach the transports, but the passages collapsed. I heard the ships leaving." She paused, and Sarah watched the child's mask crack just slightly. "My mother. Did she? Your mother evacuated safely," Sarah said, kneeling beside the rubble. "I'm going to get you out of here." "The city is lost," Liara said quietly. It wasn't a question. "Yes. Then how will we escape?" Sarah looked at the young princess, at this child who understood too much too quickly, and told her the truth. "I don't know yet, but we will." She worked quickly to free Liara from the rubble, checking for injuries as she did. The princess had a badly bruised shoulder and multiple cuts, but nothing critical. Small mercies in a day of horrors. They emerged from the gardens into a citadel that was more ruin than structure. Fires burned in sections that should not burn. The air tasted of chemicals and death. In the distance, Sarah could see the massive shapes of Kresh landing craft descending through the smoke, bringing ground forces to claim what their orbital weapons had broken. "Stay close to me," Sarah said, taking Liara's hand. "We're going underground." They moved through the destruction like ghosts, two figures navigating a maze of their worst nightmares. Sarah led them toward the old transit system that ran beneath the capital. Passages built centuries ago and half forgotten in an age of flying vehicles. If the tunnel still existed, if they hadn't collapsed, they might offer a way through the occupied zones. They found an access point in what had been a cultural museum. The entrance had been buried under debris, but Sarah cleared it using a piece of rebar as a lever, working until her hands bled and her shoulders screamed. Liara helped without being asked, her small hands moving rubble with surprising strength. The tunnel entrance opened like a mouth into darkness. Sarah activated the light on her weapon and started down the ancient stairs. Behind them, they could hear the heavy footfalls of Kresh shock troops entering the citadel, their clicking communication echoing through the dead halls. Sarah and Liara descended into the black, leaving the burning world behind. The stairs seemed endless, spiraling down into earth that still remembered what peace felt like. At the bottom, they found the transit tunnels exactly as Sarah had hoped, intact, abandoned, and very, very dark. "How far do these passages go?" Liara asked, her voice small in the enclosed space. "I studied the old city plans during the security briefing," Sarah replied, leading them forward. "These tunnels connect to the outer districts. If we can reach the industrial sector, there might be small craft that weren't part of the main evacuation. Repair shuttles, cargo haulers, anything that can break atmosphere. That's a long journey through enemy territory." "Yes, it is." They walked in silence for a time, the beam of Sarah's light cutting through darkness that had lasted centuries. Water dripped somewhere in the distance. The air tasted stale but breathable. Behind them, very far away, they heard the sound of something massive collapsing, more of the citadel dying. "Commander Chen," Liara said eventually, "why did you stay? You could have escaped with the others." Sarah considered her answer carefully. "Because no one gets left behind. Not on my watch." That's a very human thing to say. I suppose it is. They had gone perhaps half a kilometer when Sarah heard it, a sound that didn't belong in the old tunnels. A clicking, rhythmic sound that she recognized from 100 combat briefings. Kresh biosensors sweeping the underground passages for life signs. The enemy had followed them down. Sarah pulled Liara into a side passage, clicking off her light and pressing them both against the wall. In the complete darkness, she could hear the princess's breathing, quick but controlled. She could feel her own heart hammering against her ribs. The clicking grew closer, louder, and then a new sound joined it. The wet, shuffling movement of Kresh soldiers in their organic armor, moving through the tunnels like insects through a hive. Sarah tightened her grip on her weapon and on Liara's hand. They were trapped in the dark with an enemy designed for hunting in exactly these conditions. The princess's mother was somewhere in the stars above, believing her daughter lost. The city burned. The war had already been lost. But Sarah Chen had made a promise in a dying throne room, and she had never learned how to break those. In the absolute darkness of the ancient tunnels, with the enemy drawing closer with every breath, she began to plan their impossible escape. The clicking stopped, right outside their hiding place, and in that terrible silence, Sarah heard something that made her blood freeze, the sound of something breathing, tasting the air, hunting. The long road home. The darkness had weight in the tunnels beneath Valara Prime. Sarah Chen felt it pressing against her skin like something alive, something that wanted to smother her. She stood absolutely still, one hand gripping her weapon, the other holding Princess Liara's small fingers. The Kresh soldier stood less than 3 meters away, its biosensors clicking in patterns that Sarah's training had taught her to recognize. Search mode. Active hunting. The creature moved closer. Sarah could smell it now, that distinctive scent of Kresh biology like copper mixed with rotting vegetation. In the absolute blackness, she couldn't see it, but she didn't need to. She had fought these things before. She knew their shape, their speed, their casual cruelty. Beside her, Liara's breathing had gone so quiet it was almost invisible. The young princess understood without being told that even the smallest sound would end them both. Sarah felt the girl's pulse racing through their joined hands, but Liara didn't move, didn't make a sound. Royalty trained from birth to control themselves, even when terror screamed through every nerve. The Kresh soldier paused. Its breathing changed, became deeper, more focused. It was tasting the air, analyzing chemical traces with senses far superior to human or Valerian biology. Sarah slowly began to raise her weapon. If it detected them, she would have perhaps 1 second to fire before it called for reinforcements. One shot in complete darkness against an enemy designed for exactly this environment. Then, from somewhere deeper in the tunnels, came a sound. A splash of water loud in the oppressive silence. The Kresh soldier's head snapped toward the noise, sensors clicking rapidly. It moved away from their hiding spot, following the sound with the single-minded focus of a predator that had found better prey. Sarah waited until the clicking faded completely before she allowed herself to breathe. Beside her, Liara let out a tiny sound that might have been a sob or might have been relief. "We need to move," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible even in the silence. "They'll sweep this area again. Come on." They moved through the tunnels like shadows, Sarah using her light sparingly and only when absolutely necessary. The brief flashes revealed ancient walls carved with Valerian script, faded murals depicting a civilization that had thrived before anyone knew what the Kresh were. In another time, Sarah might have found them beautiful. Now they were just markers of distance, proof that they were still moving, still alive. Hours passed in the dark, or maybe it was minutes. Time lost meaning in the tunnels where day and night had never existed. Sarah's internal clock said they had been walking for 3 hours when Liara finally spoke. "I need to rest," the princess said quietly. There was no complaint in her voice, just a simple statement of fact. "My leg is injured. I did not want to slow us down, but—" Sarah immediately stopped and activated her light, keeping it low and directed at the ground. Liara's left leg was bleeding through her torn robes, a wound Sarah had somehow missed in the chaos of their escape. It wasn't life-threatening, but it was deep enough to be painful, and they had been walking for hours. "Why didn't you tell me?" Sarah asked, already digging through her emergency kit for medical supplies. "Because we needed to keep moving," Liara replied simply. "My discomfort was less important than our survival." Sarah looked at the young princess, at this child who bore pain without complaint while her world burned above them. and felt something fierce and protective settle in her chest. "Your life matters just as much as anyone else's," she said firmly. "More, actually. You're the heir to Valara. Your people will need you when this is over. If this is ever over," Liara said quietly. Sarah cleaned and bandaged the wound with quick, efficient movements born of too much combat experience. "It will be over," she said. "Wars always end. The question is what we become by the time they do." They rested for 20 minutes in a side chamber that had once been some kind of maintenance station. Ancient equipment lined the walls, technology so old it might as well have been magic. Sarah rationed out water and protein bars from her emergency kit, splitting everything evenly despite Liara's protest that Sarah needed her strength more. "Tell me about Earth," Liara said suddenly, between small bites of the protein bar. "I have read about your world, but reading is not the same as knowing." Sarah considered the question, grateful for something to think about other than their impossible situation. "Earth is loud," she said finally. 7 billion humans all talking at once, all wanting different things. We fight constantly about everything. Resources, beliefs, borders that don't really matter from space. But when something threatens us from outside, we come together. It's like we need an external enemy to remember we're all the same species. "That sounds lonely," Liara said thoughtfully, "being unable to find unity except through conflict." "Maybe it is," Sarah admitted. "What about Valara? What will you tell your children about it when this is over?" Liara was quiet for a long moment. "I will tell them it was beautiful," she said finally. "I will tell them about the singing towers and the gardens that grew in mathematical patterns, and the way the 3 moons looked when they aligned during festival season. I will tell them we had 3,000 years of peace before the Kresh came, and I will tell them that when our world fell, a human stayed behind to bring me home." Sarah felt her throat tighten. "We're not home yet." "No," Liara agreed, "but we will be, because you promised." They continued through the tunnels, and Sarah noticed that Liara's limp was less pronounced now that the wound was properly dressed. The princess moved with surprising grace despite her injury, her natural Valerian agility helping her navigate the uneven ground. They passed through sections where the tunnels had partially collapsed, squeezing through gaps barely large enough for their bodies. They waded through knee-deep water that smelled of minerals and thyme. They climbed over ancient machinery that had rusted into abstract sculpture. And always in the distance they heard the Kresh, clicking sensors, heavy footfalls, the wet sounds of their biological armor shifting as they moved. The enemy was searching, sweeping the tunnels in patterns that suggested they knew someone had escaped underground. Sarah changed their route constantly, backtracking and taking side passages whenever the sounds grew too close. It was during one of these detours that they found the shelter. The door was hidden behind a false wall that had cracked with age, revealing a chamber that the original builders had meant to stay secret. Inside, they found supplies that had been placed there recently. Within the last few months, Sarah judged. Medical kits, water purification tablets, preserved food, and most importantly, a communication device. "The Resistance," Liara breathed. "My mother told me about them. Citizens who refused to believe the Kresh peace treaty, who prepared for war anyway. Everyone thought they were paranoid." "They were right to be paranoid," Sarah said, examining the communication device. It was Valerian military technology, encrypted and designed for covert operations. "Can you work this?" Liara took the device with hands that trembled slightly. "Yes, my tutors taught me military communications. For emergencies." She looked up at Sarah. "This qualifies." It took 15 minutes for Liara to bypass the security protocols and access the Resistance network. The device came alive with encrypted chatter, dozens of voices speaking in quick, clipped Valerian. Liara listened intently, her expression growing more focused as she sorted through the chaos. "The Resistance has safe houses throughout the occupied zones," she said finally. "There's a cell operating in the industrial sector, exactly where we're heading. They have access to small craft hidden in the maintenance hangars. Commander Chen, we have a way out." Sarah felt something loosen in her chest. Hope, maybe. Or just the absence of absolute despair. "Can you contact them?" "I can try," Liara said. Her fingers moved over the device's interface with practiced precision. She spoke quietly in Valerian, using what Sarah recognized as military code phrases. The response came seconds later, a male voice speaking rapid-fire instructions. Liara's face lit up. "They know who I am. They've been searching for survivors from the Citadel. There's an extraction team waiting at coordinates they're sending now. She paused, listening. They say the Kresh have heavy patrols throughout the tunnels, but there's a route through the old geothermal vents that they don't monitor. It's dangerous, extremely hot but passable. How far? 2 kilometers. Maybe 3 hours of travel. Liara looked at Sarah with eyes that held both hope and fear. They say we need to move now. The Kresh are expanding their search patterns. This window won't stay open long. They gathered what supplies they could carry from the safe house and set out immediately. The geothermal vents were exactly as promised, dangerous and extremely hot. The temperature rose steadily as they descended into passages where the planet's heat bled through the ancient stone. Sarah's uniform soaked through with sweat. Liara's silver skin took on a dim glow, some biological response to the heat that Sarah didn't understand but found strangely beautiful. The vents were also blessedly empty of Kresh patrols. The enemy's biological sensors apparently couldn't function in the extreme heat, or perhaps they simply assumed no one would be foolish enough to travel through such hostile conditions. Whatever the reason, Sarah and Liara made good time, pushing through the heat and exhaustion with the knowledge that safety was waiting ahead. They emerged from the vents into a massive underground hangar that had once serviced the city's industrial sector. Emergency lights still functioned here, casting everything in red shadows. And waiting for them, weapons ready but pointed down, were 5 Valerian resistance fighters in makeshift armor. The leader stepped forward, a scarred female with armor pieced together from a dozen different sources. "Princess Liara," she said, and her voice cracked slightly on the title. "We thought you were lost. Your Majesty will—" She stopped, seeming to remember protocol. She dropped to one knee. Her team followed immediately. "Please rise," Liara said, and Sarah heard the princess's voice shift, taking on a tone of command that belonged to someone much older. "There is no time for ceremony. We need to reach the refugee fleet. We have a courier ship ready," the resistance leader said, standing. "Fast, lightly armed, but she'll break atmosphere. The Kresh blockade has gaps. We've been running supplies through them for weeks." She looked at Sarah. "You're human. Commander Chen, the one who stayed behind. There are stories spreading already." "Stories can wait," Sarah said. "Let's focus on surviving long enough to tell them." The courier ship was small, built for speed rather than comfort. Sarah and Liara strapped into seats that had seen better decades while the resistance team prepared for launch. The hangar's roof cracked open, ancient mechanisms groaning as they revealed a slice of smoke-stained sky. "The refugee fleet is holding position at the secondary rendezvous point," the pilot said, his hands flying over controls. 3-hour burn if we push her hard. The Kresh will detect us as soon as we clear atmosphere, but we'll be moving too fast for their fighters to intercept." "Probably." "Probably," Sarah repeated. "Nothing's certain in war, Commander. You know that." The ship launched with a force that pressed Sarah back into her seat. Through the viewport, she watched Valara Prime fall away, watched the capital city burning beneath them, watched the Kresh fleet hanging in orbit like dark stars. The ship shook violently as they punched through the atmosphere, alarms screaming warnings about hull stress and enemy sensors. Then they were through. Into the black! The ship's engines roared at maximum burn, pushing them away from the occupied world at speeds that made Sarah's teeth ache. Behind them, she could see Kresh fighters launching from their carriers, but the pilot had been right. The courier ship was simply too fast. 3 hours later, they approached the refugee fleet. Hundreds of ships drifting in space like seeds scattered by a dying flower. Transports, warships, civilian craft, all carrying the survivors of a civilization that had been broken in a single day. Among them, Sarah spotted the largest vessel, its hull marked with the royal seal, the Queen's flagship. The docking procedure seemed to take forever. Sarah watched through the viewport as mechanical arms guided them into the flagship's bay. When the airlock finally opened, they found a crowd waiting. Valerian nobles, military officers, civilian leaders, all of them staring at the courier ship with expressions Sarah couldn't read. And at the front of the crowd, wearing robes still stained with soot from the evacuation, stood Queen Thessera. The queen was tall even for a Valerian, her silver skin marked with the ritual scars of leadership. Her eyes, so like her daughter's, were rimmed with red. She had been crying. She had probably been crying for hours. Liara was first down the ramp. She moved slowly, favoring her injured leg, her torn robes hanging from her small frame. She looked nothing like a princess. She looked like what she was, a child who had survived something no child should ever experience. "Mother," Liara said, and her voice finally broke. Queen Thessera crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides. She dropped to her knees and pulled her daughter into her arms, holding her with a desperation that made Sarah's chest ache. The queen made a sound that transcended language, a noise of pure relief and anguish and love. Sarah stood at the top of the ramp, suddenly unsure of her place in this moment. She had done her job. The princess was safe. The story was over. Then Queen Thessera looked up, her eyes meeting Sarah's across the crowd. The queen stood slowly, one arm still around her daughter, and spoke in standard tongue so Sarah would understand. "Commander Sarah Chen of Earth," she said, her voice carrying through the silent bay. "You stayed behind when others fled. You risked your life for a child not of your species, not of your world. There is no word in the Valerian language for what you have done. There is no honor we could give that would be sufficient. But know this, from this day forward you are counted among the Valara. You are family, and we do not forget our family." Sarah felt her throat close. She managed to nod, unable to trust her voice. Liara pulled away from her mother and limped back up the ramp. She stood in front of Sarah and took her hand, the same hand that had pulled her from rubble, that had led her through darkness, that had promised safety when everything was lost. "Thank you," the princess said simply, "for keeping your promise." Sarah looked down at this remarkable child, this young princess who had walked through hell without complaint, who had carried pain in silence, who had held on to hope when hope was all they had. She thought about the choice she had made in the throne room, the decision that could have killed them both. "You would have done the same for me," Sarah said. "Yes," Liara agreed, "because that is what family does." 6 months later, Sarah stood on the bridge of a human cruiser, watching the stars stream past. The war with the Kresh had spread across 3 sectors, drawing in a dozen species. Earth had fully committed its forces to the fight, humanity doing what it did best, refusing to back down when the odds said they should. Her comm unit chimed, a priority message from Valerian Command. Sarah opened it and found a video message from Princess Liara. The princess looked different now, older somehow, though only months had passed. She wore formal robes and stood in what looked like a military command center. Behind her, Sarah could see the refugee fleet, grown larger now, reinforced with allied ships from across the galaxy. "Commander Chen," Liara said, smiling, "I hope this message finds you well. I wanted you to know that the Resistance has retaken the northern continent of Valara Prime. It is a small victory, but it is ours. My mother says that we fight not just to reclaim what was taken, but to honor those who gave everything to save us." She paused. "You taught me something in those tunnels. You taught me that hope is not about knowing you will survive. It is about choosing to keep moving even when survival seems impossible. We are still moving, Commander, and we will not stop until Valara is free." The message ended with Liara raising her hand in the Valerian gesture of respect, a gesture that Sarah had learned meant more than goodbye. It meant, "Until we meet again." Sarah stood on the bridge of her ship surrounded by stars and war, and raised her hand in response to the empty screen. Somewhere across the light years, a princess who had become her family was fighting to reclaim her home. Somewhere in the dark, a queen remembered the human who had kept a promise. And Sarah Chen, daughter of Earth, survivor of a dozen battles, knew that she had been right to stay behind. Some things were worth the risk. Some promises were worth keeping, even when the cost was everything. The war would continue. People would die. Worlds would burn. But somewhere in the chaos, a small light endured, a connection forged in darkness between 2 beings who should have been strangers, but had chosen to become something more. Family.